There was a time when science fiction novels were considered to be on the periphery of popular culture. Back in the 20th century, even the popularity of movie franchises like Star Wars, Alien and Terminator seemed to be credited more to the craft behind their special effects than to any interest the public might have had in the future. Moreover, it wasn't unusual for science fiction writers of the time to say that these movies were watered down examples of the genre, with the likes of Isaac Asimov remarking that Alien was just another haunted castle story. While on the flip side, the literary world generally treated the science fiction novels that inspired so many film directors like escapist fantasies meant only for people who were out of touch with the world. Things have obviously changed a lot since then. Science fiction films and television have become a little more sophisticated, and with the explosion of technological progress society has experienced, there's also more interest in sci-fi writing than ever. Nevertheless, it can still be difficult for a beginner in science fiction to know where to start. The genre offers everything from hardcore science stories to literary experimentalism worthy of James Joyce, so there's always the fear that if a novice picks up a random sci-fi book, it might end up being one that'll put them off the genre forever. Luckily, there's no shortage of Google search results to let a prospective sci-fi fan know where they should begin. On any of these lists, you'll find the genre's earliest masters with the likes of Foundation by Isaac Asimov and Dune by Frank Herbert. There are also more recent hits most people are already familiar with from their big screen adaptations, like The Martian by Andy Weir and Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. And of course there are the classic examples of mind-altering sci-fi like Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick and Neuromancer by William Gibson. Something that these titles all have in common is that, yes, every one of them is a great book for a fledgling sci-fi fan to read, but on the other hand, if you're about to delve into the ever-expanding world of sci-fi, you've probably heard of them already. You just don't need me to tell you they're great. You've heard that much from every other list of must-read books. So, like some of my previous videos, I'd rather offer you a backdoor pass into the genre. Books that are amazing examples of what science fiction can do, that are great to read whether you're familiar with this category of fiction or not, and that you hopefully might not have seen talked about in too many places before. Binti by Nnedi Okorafor. Binti by Nnedi Okorafor might not be a book that's featured on most must-read sci-fi lists yet, but to be fair, that's probably just because it's such a recent entry. That said, if you have a cursory interest in the genre, chances are you've at least heard of it. As the recipient of lavish praise from the likes of George R.R. Martin and Ursula K. Le Guin, Okorafor's star has enjoyed a stellar rise within science fiction and fantasy, and it's not without good reason. So what is it that makes her work stand out? On the surface, Okorafor's novel is a simple enough science fiction story about a woman named Binti who has a prodigious gift for mathematics. At odds with her native culture, she's forced to abandon her home to pursue an education at a galactic university. When she's travelling there, her ship is attacked by aliens who leave all of the crew dead. As the plot develops, you learn more about what makes the young woman so special, the struggle she endured to get where she is, and of course the epiphanies she experiences as she fights for her survival. Summarised like this, I suppose the book doesn't sound like anything unique, but its simplicity conceals an often unexplored point of view in science fiction. Binti, you see, is part of an African tribe who in the future have developed their own trade routes with a diverse array of alien life forms. You don't know where the United States stands at this time in history. Europe and Asia don't merit a mention either. The story is told entirely from the woman and her culture's perspective, which makes a very old parable feel invigorated with new life. It's common enough for a sci-fi story to be told by a minority comparable to those in our own time, but Binti is a particularly good example of what a sadly underrepresented viewpoint can do for the genre. What's more, it's just a great book for sci-fi readers because it offers some genuinely alien situations and environments in an extremely digestible and easy to read style, all while telling an emotionally affecting story that you'll probably get through in one sitting. Tau Zero by Poul Anderson. If you watched my recent video on Slaughterhouse-5 by Kurt Vonnegut, you'll know that within the realm of science fiction, great ideas often get simplified into easier to digest formats by tying them into more emotionally resonant storylines. Hard science fiction, as it's sometimes called, can come off as a little too intellectual for larger audiences, so what could actually be a great idea in its own right can sometimes become suffocated by the demand for a more down-to-earth plot thread. Of course, this isn't necessarily a criticism. It's very difficult to balance the science fiction and human elements within a story because they each demand so much attention. That said, Poul Anderson's book is a perfect example of how to give them both their due. Tau Zero is set on a spaceship that can travel faster than the speed of light. Standard fare for a science fiction story, you might say. Practically every sci-fi franchise has a spaceship that can zip across the solar system in a matter of seconds. However, as much as science fiction pays lip service to science, very few popular properties actually pay attention to one of its most crucial ideas. The theory of relativity, as many a curmudgeonly science pundit has pointed out, means that if you fly across the galaxy at the speed of light, all the people you knew at home will long be dead by the time you arrive at your destination. In Tau Zero, this inconvenient fact is actually the main problem at the heart of the book. The spaceship on which the characters travel is accelerating at a rate faster than any of them can control. The crew can't even stop the ship as it ploughs onwards, and are all too aware that as they speed further and further ahead in time, they're faced with the possibility that they might end up being the last humans left alive. Poul Anderson is strict in his dedication to relativity. The science behind the ship's problem is explained in no small amount of detail, and though at first this might seem to be the only point of the book, you quickly become invested in the characters as they attempt to come to terms with the horror of a situation that in all probability the human mind is just not meant to experience. Under the Skin by Michel Faber. Not all movies that get adapted from science fiction books are blockbuster hits. Under the Skin, which you might remember as that weird Scarlett Johansson film from 2013, is excellent in its own right, but it's quite different from the book on which it's based. Under the Skin by Michel Faber plays with the same themes of empathy and communication, but it leans a lot more heavily into its sci-fi trappings than the picture of the same name. In short, the woman at the centre of Under the Skin is an alien disguised as a human who drives around Scotland looking for men to seduce, abduct, and deliver to her superiors where they'll ultimately be killed. The narrative is downright absurd at times. The alien isn't dressed up as a typically attractive woman, she just has large breasts. And the misunderstandings that occur between herself and her victims are often of the type you can imagine between a man and a woman in any other comedy of errors. Nevertheless, the book has a serious literary bent that makes it a fantastic introduction to the genre for readers who enjoy a little more poetry and ambiguity in their books. Though the movie sold itself as more of an atmospheric exercise in tone than any kind of comedy, it certainly had its funny moments, and when you look at it the other way, the book isn't short on melancholy either. It goes without saying that sci-fi has long been exploring aspects of its genre beyond robots and epic space battles, though those are still a heck of a lot of fun too. But Under the Skin is a particularly good example of how deep a writer can get when they utilise science fiction not as a world in which they get to indulge their fantasies, but as an incubator in which they can increase our understanding of humanity, and in this case, explore the nature of empathy and lament the limits of how far it can go. Hyperion by Dan Simmons. One thing you might have noticed as you watched this video, even if you consider yourself to be an outsider to science fiction, is that it's an incredibly flexible tool for exploring other genres. The original Star Wars was basically a western in space. Blade Runner is about as film noir as it gets, and like Isaac Asimov complained, Alien was basically just a haunted castle story in space, albeit a much better one than he seemed to imply. I think that the main reason why sci-fi is so adaptable to these other genres is essentially that the only aspect it requires in order to be considered science fiction is for it to somehow link up with the world as we know it now. After that, any kind of plot is fair game. Hyperion by Dan Simmons is the perfect example of what I mean. Based on the structure of the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, in which a group of travellers compete to tell the most riveting tale, Hyperion recounts the individual episodes in the lives of 6 lonely people as they head toward a mysterious alien intelligence that will either grant all of their wishes or condemn them to their doom. This structure of separate episodes basically allows Dan Simmons to explore every type of story imaginable through an extremely creative science fiction lens. Time travellers, artificial intelligences, veterans of deplorable future wars and tragic romances all have their moment to shine, and, quite frankly, are better written than a lot of more mainstream authors could hope to achieve. Most importantly, at no point does it feel like the sci-fi trappings are just there as set dressing. The book is as dedicated to provoking original thought in the field of science fiction as it is to telling the compelling, emotionally moving stories of its characters. On top of all this, with Hyperion, Dan Simmons manages to build an enormous universe easily comparable with the likes of Ian M. Banks' Culture series, which I would have included on the list here, except that I think it's a tiny bit more well known than Hyperion, but they're both great writers, so I guess you can consider this an honourable mention for Consider Phlebas too. Dahlgren by Samuel Orr Delaney. Finally, I want to mention that when I was doing a little research for this video, I noticed that a lot of suggestions people were getting for their entry into sci-fi tend to be pretty safe. I think the assumption is that if you haven't read much science fiction before, then you must not have read a lot of books at all, so it's best to start off with the kind of easier reading experiences you might find on the young adult shelf, which is fine and all, but it's important to remember that if you're looking for something a little more complicated, there is plenty of stuff that could easily be compared with the likes of the aforementioned James Joyce. Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, for example, easily fits into the mould of science fiction and makes for a particularly sturdy doorstop if you find you're unable to get through it. And House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielowski is an amazingly layered horror story that might not exactly be science fiction, but certainly enjoys playing with the oddness of its physics-defying plot in the same vein as writers like Jorge Luis Borges or Franz Kafka. All told though, if there's one weighty literary sci-fi masterpiece I'd recommend above all the others, it would have to be Dahlgren by Samuel Orr Delaney. On a basic level, Dahlgren is about a kid with no name exploring a post-apocalyptic city that seems to be forever changing shape as he walks around it. The book was written in the 1960s and is very much in tune with the culture clashes of that time, but because it's set in such a dystopian future, it manages to conjure up an atmosphere that isn't really limited to a particular era. Even so, I've mentioned it alongside some of the densest postmodern books of the 20th century, so there's obviously a lot more to it than that. Delaney's writing ties in with ancient mythology, poetry. It's extremely experimental in how the plot unfolds and, in all honesty, deserves to be read at least 2 times before you decide what's going on. More if you want to figure out a completely different interpretation on a 3rd or 4th go around. You know, I actually got the idea for this YouTube channel when I started typing up my thoughts on the book, but it's proven to be way too much of an intimidating prospect to actually publish anything on so far. All told, Dahlgren and all the other books I've mentioned here are just a small selection of science fiction novels that won't always get recommended to you as a first-time reader. I don't actually claim to be an expert on the subject. I'm still exploring the genre like a lot of you guys are, so if you've got a recommendation yourself, make sure to leave it in the comments. I know there's about 1 billion great books I haven't read, so it'd be good to find out what some of them are. Hello everyone, Simon here. I just wanted to sneak in a little self-promotion and let you know that I'm actually a science fiction author myself. My most recent book is called Icon Violet. If you're into the kind of novels I've talked about not just in this video, but on this channel in general, then you should probably give it a shot. Check out the links in the description to find out where you can get it, or you can forget I said anything and we can all get on with our lives. In my next video I'll be sticking to the world of science fiction to take an in-depth look at Slaughterhouse-5 by Kurt Vonnegut. You should subscribe so you don't miss out, and once again, make sure to leave a comment with your sci-fi book recommendations in the comments below. Until then,